Good morning, brethren. It's certainly good to be here this year again with all of you. The article I'm about to read was written, like Mr. Gale said yesterday, for the Feast magazine, which was distributed in 2012 at the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's a fictional projection of the possibilities in regards to the challenges of cleaning up the pollution of the oceans. The OCC, Oceanic Cleanup Crew, which was established shortly after the return of Christ some 20 years ago, is pleased to announce that this week its function of cleaning up the ocean of debris, sunken ships, and huge slugs floating around the oceans composed of plastic bottles, syringes, nylon nets, and other paraphernalia, which the prior age had polluted the oceans with, has been completed. The shorelines of the continents have been cleaned up of any debris washed ashore also. Shortly after the OCC was established under the auspices of the branch of government responsible for the nations, with men like Moses, Abraham, and Joseph in positions of responsibilities, the OCC built a huge 1,500-foot, totally pollution-free vessel with the capabilities of lifting sunken vessels and ships laying on the bottom of the ocean from previous wars and also from the destruction of the Great Tribulation, and raise them up. Using developed methods of buoyancy and hydraulics, these sunken ships were able to be actually brought into the hull of the OCC ship named the Starfish and be totally dismantled and recycled for peaceful purposes. The backup ships and barges for transporting material back to the mainland for reuse were also utilized in this massive project, which included 700,000 square foot barges and a fleet of 20 smaller vessels for shoreline cleanup and recycling. Any ships which had been using nuclear fusion for propulsion were able to be safely neutralized and material used for peaceful purposes. The ships were cut up using new technology and techniques of cutting steel with extremely high water pressure, and the material sent to foundries for the steel, aluminum, and other materials to be recycled, and to farm implements, plows, and tractors. Other materials were able to be recycled also. We were even able to raise and recycle ships such as the Titanic, the Lusitania, and other warships sunk during the three world wars the world had gone through from the past. At a ceremony in Jerusalem, Christ congratulated the captain and crew and also the members of the support team of ships and barges used to complete this project. The Starfish and other smaller vessels used for this operation were also dismantled and the material used and recycled for peaceful purposes. The men involved in this project have now been employed in the peaceful and useful manufacturing of farm implementations. This was a joyful occasion since the shores and oceans are now completely pollution-free from the abuse and pollution of man from the previous age. This report was submitted by Captain Charles J. Taylor of the OCC Mothership Starfish. Now, what motivated me to write this article for the Feast newspaper was a program I watched on TV about an excursion by Jacques Cousteau's son onto the islands of Hawaii, a chain of islands out of bounds for people except a few scientific teams doing studies there. I was surprised by the fact that the shores of these remote islands were strewn with nylon fish nets, washed ashore, plastic containers, small plastic objects, and other junk which was had been discarded into the ocean. It was affecting the birds of the islands since they were swallowing these small plastic objects, and it negatively affected other wildlife also. The pollution of the oceans is one of the several challenges we will have to deal with at the onset of the millennium and into the millennium, since some will take years, literally years, to correct. And today I would like to look at the problems and some possible solutions. So the title of my sermon is called Rebuilding and Reclamation in the Millennium. When you consider the conditions of the earth at the onset of the millennium, it's not something you can just wish away, but it has to be dealt with. Consider that plastic containers have a lifespan of 1,000 years. It would be irresponsible to just leave them to pollute the oceans and landscape. My first point is in regards to the oceans and rivers. When I was younger, a long time ago, in New Westminster, a town in BC where I was raised and born, was a huge 20-foot cement culvert dumping raw sewage into the Fraser River and eventually out into the ocean. You could see all kinds of paraphernalia floating out of this culvert. It was a good place to catch fish like sturgeons, who are bottom feeders, although I would not recommend anyone eating them based on what, the diet that they were eating coming out of this, sewer, and the fact that they're unclean. There was a slaughterhouse over a creek not far from where I lived, and the stench at low tide, when the tide was low, was just horrendous. It was obnoxious. What they did is they deposited the intestines of slaughtered animals through a hole in the floor, and it went into the creek, and eventually into the river, into the oceans. Years ago, in the Plain Truth magazine, they showed a river in the US where it was prohibited to swim and in danger of catching fire due to pollution. Pollution in the Rhine River is high. It was high because of the heavy industrial industries along the river dumping their toxic and industrial waste, which eventually flowed into the ocean. There's an article about this I'd like to read to you, written several years ago, and it says, pollution in the Rhine River. As long as people have lived near the Rhine, they have thrown their refuse into the water. In the past, the river was usually able to clean itself and break down pollutants. However, since the Industrial Revolution, the volume of water has risen greatly, and the type of waste changed. Today, industrial effluents mixed with domestic waste, sewage, phosphates, and heavy material like lead and mercury. Not all these pollutants are biodegradable, and some are very highly toxic. Many types of industries have established themselves along the banks of the rivers. The chemical industry disposes of waste containing heavy metals such as radium or cadmium and lead and mercury. The paper-making, brewing, and detergents industries also dump their waste into the river. Although most of these emissions are properly authorized, some emissions are not, and there is always the risk of accidental spills or leaks. Households dispose of a variety of waste products, soap, detergent, leftovers, and sewage. People often throw things directly into the river, from pieces of, such as pieces of paper, to rusting bed frames and old bicycles. Many agricultural practices lead to organic waste. Chemical fertilizers and other waste products reach the river. Fertilizers contain various chemicals from phosphates and nitrates to poisonous hydrocarbons. Now, fortunately, the situation has improved greatly in the last few years, and it's not near as bad as it used to be in the past. I saw a program on TV about a company moving their manufacturing plant from Texas into Mexico. They were not allowed to dump toxic waste in the Rio Grande River in Texas, but across the border, with no tax and no regulations, they were dumping their pollutants into the Rio Grande. As a result, there was disastrous consequences. Mexican children of families who lived along the river were born with all kinds of defects. The fish and wildlife were also negatively affected, with deformed offspring and premature aborted fetuses. All for the sake of money. Did you know that the biggest dump landfill in the world is where it actually is the biggest dump? This is from the internet. It has been described as the world's largest rubbish dump, or the Pacific plastic soup, which is starting to alarm scientists. It is a vast area of floating plastic debris. It is this vast area of human drifting in the northern Pacific Ocean, held there by swirling ocean currents. Discovered in 1997 by American sailor Charles Moore, what it is also called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is now alarming some with its ever-growing size and possible impact on human health. The patch is in fact two huge linked areas of circulating rubbish, says Dr. Marcus Erickson, research director of the US-based Algalita Marine Research Foundation, founded by Moore. Although the boundaries change, it stretches from about 500 nautical miles off the coast of California and the northern Pacific and near the coast of Japan. The islands of Hawaii are placed almost in the middle, so piles of plastics regularly wash up on the shores and beaches there. The original idea that people had was that it was an island of plastic garbage that you could almost walk in. It's not quite like this. It's almost like a plastic soup, Dr. Erickson says. It's endless, and it's endless for an area that may be twice the size of the continental United States. Can you imagine that? A garbage dump in the ocean, twice the size of the United States. That's pretty astonishing. Pollution is only one of the problems. The other is shipwrecks and sunken ships and their payloads. You might wonder, what is the number that entails? What is the actual number that entails? There are over 3 million shipwrecks in the ocean, according to the UN. There are some 10,000 in the Great Lakes alone, shipwrecks. The current world fleet of merchant ships is 55,000, and this does not include warships or pleasure crafts. Let's turn over to Revelation 8 and read, starting in verse 8, going into some of the things that the Bible says about what's going to happen. Over in Revelation 8, and beginning in verse 8, we read, "Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood." And verse 9, "And a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed." Verse 10, then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. 1/3 of the ships were destroyed as a result of this. You could land up with something around 4 million shipwrecks to deal with and clean up in the millennium. This is an enormous task. During the millennium, you just can't ignore the problem and hope that it goes away. It has to be dealt with in a safe manner while not polluting the environment. Today's technology to cut steel, which could be used to dismantle ships. When I was working in the Lower Mainland, one of the employees invented a cutting torch using natural gas, which could cut through 6 inches of solid steel. That's 6 inches of solid steel, and it had a smooth edge as opposed to a rugged edge which some oxygen acetylene torches leave. So using natural gas is a non-polluting torch. It's one of the things that could be used in the millennium, obviously. Now, how will the cleanup of the oceans and rivers be accomplished? For one thing, I think by the time Christ returns, there will not be much industrial activity. Plants and foundries that will require startup won't be allowed to pollute the rivers, and will have to develop methods that deal with any potentially harmful leftovers from the production processes. As far as the oceans are concerned, we cannot leave ships, some of them with radioactive materials or nuclear warheads, just corrode and pollute the oceans. They have to be dealt with, has to be solved. They need to be neutralized and dismantled. We will have to develop the technology to raise and recycle ships on the ocean floor. That huge landfill has to be dealt with, and to remove the plastic and recycle the products which are floating in it, the one in the Pacific Ocean. No more raw sewage in the oceans. Sewer treatment plants will have to be used in which we have current technology. It's not just being used on a global basis, but done correctly, the water after the process should be good enough to drink. We got the technology to actually do that. Let's go over to Revelation 8 again. I actually read that. No, the problem too is that if the oceans turn to blood, animals can't live in blood, so there's going to be a tremendous amount of death in the oceans. I want to go to Ezekiel 47, and this is getting down to the solution of the problems of the pollution of the oceans. In Ezekiel 47, beginning in verse 1, Ezekiel 47 and verse 1, it says, "Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and there was water flowing from under the threshold of the temple towards the east, for the front of the temple faced east, and water was flowing from under the right side of the temple, south of the altar." And in verse 2, "He brought me out by way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the outer gateway that faces east, and there was water running out on the right side." And continuing on here, "And when the man went out to the east with the line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits. He brought me through the water. The water came up to my ankles. Again he measured 1,000 and brought me through the waters, and it came up to my knees. Again he measured 1,000 and brought me through the water, and it came up to my waist." So it was getting deeper as he went further away from the temple. "Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not cross, for the waters were too deep, water in which one must swim, a river that could not be crossed. He said to me, "Son of man, have you seen this?" Then he brought me and returned me to the bank of the river. When I returned, there, along the bank of the river, were very many trees on one side and the other. Then he said to me, "This water flows towards the east region, goes down into the valley, and enters the sea. When it reaches the sea, its waters are healed." And in verse 9, "And it shall be that every living thing that moves wherever the river goes will live. There will be a great multitude of fish because these waters go there, for they will be healed, and everything will live where the river goes." So God has a plan to replenish the fish and animals that have died, and also to clean up the waters and make them pristine, clean as far as soluble pollutants are concerned. We as God's children will have to develop methods of removing the physical materials such as ships, wood, plastics, other materials in the oceans, and recycle them for peaceful purposes. That's going to be one of the responsibilities that we will have in the millennium, the cleaning up of the oceans. Now, the second area I want to talk about today is the land. One of the first things which has to be done to clean up the land is to bury the dead. It's one of the first, because of sickness and disease which can be produced, which will be in the millions. It will take some time. In fact, the Bible indicates up to 7 months to accomplish. If you'd like to go to Ezekiel 39, and we'll start in verse 11 in regards to this. Ezekiel 39 and verse 11 says, "It will come to pass in that day that I will give Gog a burial place there in Israel, the valley of those who pass by east of the sea, and it will be obstruct travelers, because there they will bury Gog and all his multitude. There they will call it the valley of Hamon-Gog." Ezekiel 39, verse 12, "For 7 months the house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land." Of course, you can't leave dead bodies just lying around. I mean, a disease and all kinds of problems can come from it. So one of the other things that we'll have to determine is inventory. In other words, what is left that is working and useful. And there's no point in manufacturing a product if there is still plenty left usable in the world, somewhere in the world. One of the biggest tasks will be dealing with the cities. Turn over to Revelation 16, and we'll read what Revelation 16 has to say about that. In Revelation 16, and beginning in verse 17, it says in Revelation 16 and verse 17, "Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, 'It is done.'" And in Revelation 16:18, "And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on the earth. Now the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon was remembered before God to give the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath." It took several years to clean up where the Twin Towers in New York collapsed. So rebuilding the cities of the world is a task that needs to be accomplished. Let's look at Amos chapter 9 and verse 13 and 14. In Amos 9 and verse 13, it says, Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the threaders of grapes him who seeds. The mountains shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow from it. And in verse 14, I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. The total number of cities as of October in 2009 was 36,722 from a Google search. Today it would be slightly higher, a little higher than 36,722. How long do you suppose it will take just to clean up the rubble and recycle the concrete blacktop, steel, etc. from those cities? I saw a program where a man had a huge drum with rollers in which he could put a city bus, a big city bus inside, and it would just grind the bus to little pieces of metal. Since the cities will be rebuilt and the old ones will have to be cleaned up as far as recycling is concerned, and new ones built according to how Christ wants them built. There won't be any 100-story buildings anymore and huge apartment complexes which are festered with crime, but they will be beautifully built. Since not everyone will be living on farms, there will still be a requirement and a need for manufacturing of goods requiring people to work there. It has to be blended in with housing and parks, beautiful fountains, and sculptures like the birds in front of the auditorium in Pasadena at the former college there. They have to be safe places for children to play without fear. One of the most comforting scriptures in the Bible in regards to this is found in Zechariah. In Zechariah verse 8, I'd like to turn there in the Old Testament. Zechariah 8, beginning in verse 4, it says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each one with his staff in his hand, because of great age. The streets of the city will be full of boys and girls playing in the streets. Every city that will be rebuilt will be safe for children to play in." Another area to consider is types of energy for housing. And housing itself, since they have to last at least 1,000 years throughout the millennium. When thinking of this, I kind of envisioned a slaughterhouse on the edge of a town with attached butcher shop and a leather goods store from the processing the hides, and a fertilizer store from processing the materials, the hooves and the bones, which could be dried up and ground up and used for fertilizer in the garden. So you could have it all side by side in one area. Some of you may remember the large digester that had been built at Big Sandy campus, the Ambassador College campus there, at one time. And I went to the internet and there was an article on it, and this is what the article said. It says, on the campus, referring to Ambassador College, there was a unique contraption. It was called the digester. It was designed in Sweden, built there, and Worldwide Church of God paid to have it shipped from Stockholm to Big Sandy. The concept was original, and it worked this way. It was 60 feet long, a metal cylinder. It was about 15 feet in diameter. It had 3 internal compartments. And it was mounted at about 5-degree angle and rotated at approximately 1 revolution per hour. In other words, it went around 1 time per hour. Garbage, no cloth or metal, was fed into the top compartment. Digestive enzymes were introduced, and this garbage was left to ferment for a week. At the end of that time, the top inner compartment was opened, and the garbage fell into the second and middle chamber. New garbage was now fed into the top chamber. At the end of the second week, the last and lowest inner chamber was opened to receive the pulverized garbage from the second chamber. And the second chamber was received, was fermenting at the top chamber. More garbage was then poured into the empty top compartment. At the end of 3 weeks, the lowest chamber was opened and the contents recovered for soil distribution. By now, this substance was reduced to a soil clay substance which had no smell and provided perfect organic topsoil that allowed the abundant growth of new fruits and vegetables. The above procedure was repeated for all new garbage coming in. Not only did Big Sandy get rid of their garbage this way, which is quite interesting, but the whole town of Gladwater, Texas, a population of about 7,500 in those days, they used the digester as well for no fee. The college didn't charge them to do that. And at the end, you had a product that was like a fertilizer, didn't smell, and you could use it in your garden. So you can see that there are ways in which we can develop to recycle garbage in the millennium and other materials. We will also have the responsibility to accomplish the following, which is outlined over in Isaiah 2 and verse 4. Over in Isaiah 2 and verse 4. Isaiah 2 and verse 4 says, "He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." In modern terms, we will turn tanks into tractors, battleships and planes into useful farm implements, and dismantle the missiles in the silos across the world, recycle them, and the cement silos could be used as wells or storage capabilities. The task is enormous and will not be done in one day in the future. And the oceans and land will be pollution-free with pristine waters in the lakes where you catch a fish with only 2 eyes, not with 3 eyes and full of worms. The third area I'd like to cover today is the air. The 2 biggest pollutants of the air are the internal combustion engine and also industrial waste sent into the air. After the aftermath of the tribulation, I don't see how many industries will be still functioning. Those which do will not produce useful things such as housing needs, clothing and furniture and other needful utensils for people will be shut down. If they don't produce these things, they'll be shut down. And harmful chemical plants which make war implements will be shut down also. New plants will be engineered to be totally eco-friendly and non-polluting to the atmosphere and the water supply. Cars will have to be pollution-free, either electric or with solar panels and batteries, or an engine designed to burn hydrogen, the fuel which is clean burning and doesn't pollute the atmosphere. Like an engine, for example, that would separate water, take the hydrogen out of water. It'd be totally pollution-free. When a more powerful engine is required to run huge moving equipment, like diesel fuel, for example, to run a Caterpillar, are required, it's going to be obviously designed so that it doesn't pollute the atmosphere. So these are interesting challenges which we're going to have to face and meet and solve. The last area I want to talk about is the final frontier, if you ever watch Star Wars, and that's space. It's amazing. Space debris, also known as space junk and space waste, is the collection of objects around the world which no longer serve a useful purpose. The vast majority, estimated at 10 million pieces of junk. This does not include functional satellites that are being used. This is just the junk in space, not including the satellites. I don't think we can just ignore space junk, waiting to be awakened at night, some piece of junk falling through your living room ceiling. My neighbor experienced a rock from a blast across the street, several hundred feet higher than her. It was up on a hill, and they used too much dynamite, and she was standing in her living room, and this rock came crashing through the ceiling, 18-inch hole in the ceiling it left, and it went right through the floor into the crawl space while she was standing there. And as a result, she almost had a heart attack. But you don't want something like that to happen in the millennium, some piece of space junk coming down through the roof of your house. The problem has to be dealt with. How? I don't really know, but probably the technology will have to be developed. If engineers and scientists can put a man on the moon, they can clean up the junk from space around the Earth. One way I thought it would be for the small objects is to have the huge net with a positive electrical charge on it, and it would pick up, the material through magnetism. But I don't know what that's going to be done. Regardless of the method used, it has to be cleaned up. I mean, you just can't leave it. Are we going to continue to use peaceful communication satellites? I don't know. We have to see what can be developed here on Earth besides, polluting space with all kinds of junk and satellites as far as communication is concerned. So today we have looked at some of the challenges we will face at the onset of the millennium to make the world a better place. We have to look at the challenges in regards to the oceans, in regards to the land, the air, and also into space. These areas have to be cleaned up to make the world safe, environmentally, and a pleasant place to live and raise families for the human race. Now, how important is it? Let's go over to Romans 8. And we'll read verse 16. In Romans 8, beginning in verse 16, it says, "The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together." And continuing on, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly awaits for the revelation of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope." And in verse 21, "Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the sons of God." So the pollution and the problems that we see today will be delivered from the bondage that they're under right now. "For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." It's like the earth is crying out with birth pangs with all the pollution we see today. Help us. And in verse 23, "Not all not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of the body. So what that's telling us is that we are earnestly waiting to be, changed into God beings so that we can help solve these problems. You see, brethren, the whole creation waits for the sons of God to be engaged in the solution of these worldwide, pollution problem. One day what we will see is also described in the book of Isaiah. If you'd like to turn to Isaiah 2 to give you a description of what it will be like in Isaiah chapter 2, and beginning in verse 2, we'll read 2 to 4. In Isaiah 2 and 2 it says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. Many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And war is something that is learned, and they will not learn war anymore. And over a few chapters in Isaiah 11, further describing what it would be like in the millennium, we can read in Isaiah 11 and verse 1, it says, "There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of its roots." In verse 2, "And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. His delight is in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by the sight of his eyes, nor decide by the hearing of his ears. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with the equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Righteousness shall be the left of his loins, and faithfulness the belt of his waist." And in verse 6, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." So it shows you the conditions we will be living under. And in verse 7, "The cow and the bear shall graze, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child will play in the cobra's hole, and the weaned child will put his hand in the viper's den." In other words, the poisonous snakes will not be harming young children. "They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full, the whole earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the seas." And the waters covering the seas will be pollution-free. What is pictured here is a peaceful earth, free from wars, fears, and the former pollution created by man, which eventually will be cleaned up so that we will have clean, pristine oceans, rivers, lakes, clean air, and the land to grow healthy crops, and in a clean outer space from which objects cannot crash to the earth. So these are just some of the many responsibilities and tasks we will be involved in during the millennium, which this week pictures.